Hour. I'll be reading from the April 2nd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: Anthropic took action to mitigate the harm caused by the accidental exposure of the underlying instructions it uses to direct Claude Code, its AI agent app. U.S. stocks rose for the second straight day before Trump addressed the nation. The S&P 500, NASDAQ, and Dow gained 0.7%, 1.2%, and 0.5% respectively. Elon Musk's SpaceX moved closer to staging what could be the largest initial public offering ever, at between $40 billion and $80 billion. U.S. factory activity expanded in March, but the ISM gauge flashed a warning that inflation is accelerating as the war in Iran goes on. Franklin Templeton, a heavyweight in traditional stock and bond fund management, said it would buy a spin-off from Coin Fund to expand its crypto investment offering. Bayer is looking at expanding its pharmaceutical manufacturing presence in the U.S. as the business turns to that market to assist a turnaround. Intel agreed to buy Apollo's 49% stake in the company's Fab 34 joint venture chip manufacturing plant in Ireland for $14.2 billion. Shares of Nike fell 15.5% after executives forecast lower revenue, especially in China, where they said sales this quarter could fall by as much as 20%. Conagra narrowed its annual forecast amid mixed quarterly results, as strength in frozen meals and snacks drove organic sales growth and inflation weighed on profit. Now for the key article on the worldwide section. The Supreme Court appeared to signal to the public, and perhaps to the president, that it isn't dismissing out of hand Trump's effort to redefine American citizenship. Trump raised with advisors the possibility of withdrawing from NATO if allies don't help reopen the Strait of Hormuz, as growing tensions with Europeans threaten the pact that has underpinned the post-World War II order. Trump sought to reassure Americans that the war is in the national interest, arguing it was necessary to decimate a regime threatening the U.S. and insisting the economic pain would be short-lived. Since the start of the war, transits through the Strait of Hormuz are down 95%, and on average fewer than 5 ships passed through the waterway each day in March. 4 astronauts took off on their first crewed journey into moon orbit since 1972 with the launch of Artemis II. Trump backed a plan to fund most of the Department of Homeland Security, resolving a standoff between GOP congressional leaders. The Trump administration is preparing to rework its steel and aluminum tariff regime, altering duties on finished products to help simplify compliance. The U.S. lifted sanctions on Venezuela's interim president, easing the path to deepen cooperation with Caracas. New DNA testing showed serial killer Ted Bundy was responsible for the murder of a Utah teen in 1974. The UAE cracked down on Iranians in the country, canceling visas among other measures to protest against Tehran's daily aerial attacks. A 3-judge panel in Wisconsin dismissed a lawsuit brought by Democratic voters that sought to redraw the state's Republican-friendly congressional boundaries. Diaries of an aide to former Chinese leader Mao Zedong can remain in the U.S., a judge ruled, preventing what some observers feared might be the materials returned to China and their suppression. The picture on today's front page shows 4 astronauts smiling and waving to the crowd, and that headline reads, NASA aims to orbit moon for first time since '72. The caption, to boldly go. The crew of NASA's Artemis II, Jeremy Hansen, Victor Glover, Reed Wiseman, and Christina Cook, head to the Cape Canaveral launch pad Wednesday for the first human space flight to orbit the moon in a half-century. The article, NASA launches Artemis II mission. The agency seeks to accomplish a lunar return with an astronaut flyby, by Micah Maidenberg. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. 4 astronauts took off on a journey to the moon, a mission intended by NASA to ignite a new era of space exploration, following years of delays and setbacks. NASA's Space Launch System rocket roared off its launch pad at 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, leaving plumes streaking across the sky as its boosters and engines fired away. Shortly after the initial ascent, the rocket's upper stage separated from the main part of the SLS rocket and began flying with the Orion crew vehicle attached to it. The upper stage began in-orbit maneuvers to set up the spacecraft for the flight planned to take the astronauts more than 250,000 miles from Earth. Quote, "We have a beautiful moonrise," said Reed Wiseman, the NASA astronaut serving as mission commander, about 5 minutes after the launch. We're heading right at it. The Artemis II mission is part of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration's renewed push to return American astronauts to the moon's surface. The Artemis mission seeks to lay the groundwork for a permanent NASA base on the moon and eventually missions deeper into space. Traveling on Orion are Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Cook from NASA's Astronaut Corps, and Canada's Jeremy Hansen. The 4 have trained for years for the mission, aiming to become the first people to travel out to the moon in more than 5 decades. Their mission is to circle around the moon, setting a record for the deepest that humans have ever flown in space. The crew won't land on the lunar surface. Transporting astronauts there is the goal of a future Artemis mission, planned for 2028. while NASA's Apollo missions focused on landing crews on the lunar surface in a race with the Soviet Union, this time around NASA and its allies are competing with China, an ascendant space power that is planning its own research base on the moon. NASA regularly sends astronauts a couple hundred miles above Earth, but it hasn't mounted a flight like this one with a crew since the last Apollo mission in 1972. The crew will live and work in a space spanning about 330 cubic feet, equivalent to about 2 minivans, dining on made-for-orbit broccoli au gratin, couscous, and other meals. Exercise will run about 30 minutes each day. Artemis 2 is planned to last about 10 days and take the crew around the far side of the moon before the return to Earth. It is meant as a stepping stone to even more ambitious flights in the years ahead, including what NASA officials hope will be at least one landing of astronauts on the surface of the moon in 2028. A few issues cropped up in the early stages of flight, including a temporary dropout of the communication system on Orion and an issue with the ship's toilet, officials said at the briefing. Other articles from the front page follow. Court wary of citizenship curbs. Justices signal their unease with Trump's order, but tussle with both sides of issue. By James Romesser, Louise Radnofsky, and Lydia Wheeler. Washington. President Trump's bid to redefine U.S. citizenship might still be a legal long shot. But on Wednesday, the Supreme Court seemed to go out of its way to signal to the public, and perhaps to a combative president, that it isn't dismissing his position out of hand. For more than 2 hours, the justices heard arguments on the legality of Trump's executive order seeking to exclude U.S.-born children from automatic citizenship if their parents are living here illegally or on a temporary visa. After spending weeks disparaging the court, Trump attended part of the hearing in person. Beforehand, some legal experts predicted the president would lose the case in a rout. After all, lower court judges have resoundingly rejected his executive order, calling it glaringly unconstitutional. One of those judges said that in 4 decades on the bench, he had never seen a case where the outcome was as clear as this one. But the justices of the Supreme Court didn't seem to agree that it is so simple. Trump might end up losing the case, perhaps by a lopsided margin. Some members of the court's 6-justice conservative majority voiced clear unease about upending birthright citizenship to deal with modern issues. It's a new world, Chief Justice John Roberts said. It's the same Constitution. Still, Roberts and his fellow conservatives also asked tough questions of the American Civil Liberties Union lawyer challenging the executive order. They seem to be genuinely grappling with the administration's arguments about why the long-accepted understanding of the Fourth Amendment citizenship clause might be wrong. Those arguments focused on narrow and historical questions like the meaning of domicile in the 19th century when the amendment was ratified. The court's 3 liberal justices, meanwhile, said accepting the administration's argument would be an unwarranted sea change in what it means to be a U.S. citizen. About 36 countries across the globe have unconditional birthright citizenship, according to a map from the Library of Congress. Most of them are in the Western Hemisphere. Most countries in Europe, by contrast, confer citizenship based on parents' lineage, the sort of policy the Trump administration is pointing to as a model. A decision in the case is expected by summer. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump weighs pulling U.S. out of NATO. Iran war tensions threaten to break up alliance that has long been a bulwark. By Alexander Ward, Robbie Gramer, and Bojan Panchevsky. Washington. President Trump has raised with his advisors the possibility of withdrawing from NATO if allies don't help reopen the Strait of Hormuz, U.S. officials said, as growing tensions with Europeans threaten the alliance that has been the foundation of the post-World War II order. He hasn't explicitly given an order to pull the U.S. out of the alliance that has stood for more than 3/4 of a century, the officials said. But they said that Trump has discussed leaving NATO or potentially finding ways to weaken the U.S. commitment to the organization. Trump has made no final decision about the future of the U.S. role in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the officials said. Trump's comments, made recently to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others in private conversations, come as he urges Europeans to pry open the Strait of Hormuz so the U.S. can end its military campaign against Iran. He has railed against NATO for not joining U.S.-Israeli military efforts against Iran. A law passed by Congress in 2023 prohibits a president from unilaterally withdrawing the U.S. from NATO. Doing so requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate or a joint act of Congress. In a national address on the course of the war Wednesday night, Trump said the Strait of Hormuz would open up naturally once the war ended. He threatened that if Iran doesn't reach a deal with the U.S., America would carry out strikes on the country's power plants. Trump's conversations about the U.S. role in NATO come as European leaders have hardened their stances toward Trump. Polls show the Iran war is deeply unpopular among European voters. Even leaders who were once considered among his closest allies have expressed growing frustration with him over the Iran conflict and his demands. Anthropic leak reveals code for Claude by Sam Schechner and Robert McMillan. Anthropic is racing to contain the fallout after accidentally exposing the underlying instructions it uses to direct Claude Code, the artificial intelligence agent app that has won the company an edge with developers and businesses. By Wednesday morning, Anthropic representatives had used a copyright takedown request to force the removal of more than 8,000 copies and adaptations of the raw Claude Code instructions, known as source code, that developers shared on programming platform GitHub. It later narrowed its takedown request to cover just 96 copies and adaptations, saying its initial ask reached more GitHub accounts than intended. The leak of some internal source code didn't expose customer information or data, a spokesman for Anthropic said, nor did it divulge the valuable inner mathematics, sometimes called weights, of the company's expensive and powerful AI models. This was a release packaging issue caused by human error, not a security breach. We're rolling out measures to prevent this from happening again, the spokesman said. Lilly's pill approval tees up diet drug battle by Peter Loftus. The weight loss pill wars start now. Eli Lilly's once daily pill for weight loss got approval from U.S. drug regulators Wednesday. The all clear sets up a battle with rival Novo Nordisk, which has been selling a pill version of its Wegovy since the start of this year. The Wegovy pill has had one of the best drug launches in history. Now that the Food and Drug Administration has approved its pill, Lilly will seek to overtake the rival and further its dominance of the booming $70 billion plus market for weight loss and diabetes drugs known as GLP-1s. Empty EV parts factories create a new rust belt. GM supplier Magna is stuck with a plant to build parts for electric pickups. The magnitude of uncertainty is unparalleled. By Sharon Turlip, St. Clair, Michigan. At first, North America's biggest auto parts supplier was thrilled to snag the job of making enclosures for the batteries in General Motors' new electric pickup. The contract was so big and promised to be for years to come that Magna International built a new factory in a Michigan cornfield. 5 years later, that million-square-foot plant is mostly empty and losing money, a casualty of America's messy breakup with electric vehicles. It is one of dozens of now desolate or sparsely used EV parts plants across the country. Now, the war in Iran has driven gas prices up so sharply that EV enthusiasts are daring to wonder whether U.S. car buyers are willing to give the vehicles another look. But Magna and its big Detroit customers are forging ahead with plans to roll back EV investments. It can take years to pivot a factory and supply chain from one type of vehicle to another, and it would take 4 to 6 months of higher gas prices for most Americans to reconsider more fuel-efficient vehicles, said Paul Jacobson, GM's chief financial officer. We certainly don't see it today, he said recently. There's a chart on the front page showing auto sales feel the pinch. Overall, U.S. new vehicle sales are expected to have dropped 7% in the first quarter. And GM, Ford, and Nissan have the biggest drop. Tesla and Honda are in the middle. Toyota and Hyundai have no drop at all. Now for other articles within the paper. Trump backs Senate on DHS pay plan by Siobhan Hughes, Olivia Beavers, and Natalie Andrews, Washington. President Trump on Wednesday endorsed a two-part plan to quickly fund most of the Department of Homeland Security and then use a special procedure to pay for immigration enforcement with only GOP votes stepping in to resolve a standoff between Republican congressional leaders. We are going to work as fast and as focused as possible to replenish funding for immigration enforcement without needing Democratic votes, Trump wrote on Truth Social. The approach Trump backed effectively sides with Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, in what had become an ugly GOP dispute. Lawmakers are on a 2-week break, while some DHS employees continue to go without pay. Congress can now pass a bill funding most of DHS that the Senate approved last week, and Trump set a goal of June 1st for funding the rest of the department using the budget reconciliation process. The move requires a simple majority for budget-focused bills rather than the 60 votes typically required in the Senate, which Republicans control 53 to 47. From World Watch, Venezuela. U.S. lifts sanctions on interim leader. The Trump administration on Wednesday lifted sanctions against interim President Delcy Rodriguez, easing Washington's path to deepen cooperation with Caracas to expand oil output and U.S. foreign investment. Her removal from the sanctions list ends prohibitions barring Americans from doing business with her at the risk of facing civil or criminal penalties. This decision reflects progress in the joint efforts between our two countries to promote stability, support economic recovery, and advance political reconciliation in Venezuela, White House spokeswoman Anna Kelly said. Rodriguez praised the decision as a significant step in the right direction to normalize relations with the U.S., and that was by Vera Bergengruen. Ukraine. Russia claims it controls Luhansk. Russia's armed forces have taken control of the entire Luhansk region of Ukraine, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed on Wednesday. But a Kyiv military official denied that, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky prepared for talks with U.S. envoys trying to mediate an end to Moscow's invasion. Units of the groups of forces west have completed the liberation of the Luhansk People's Republic, said Russian Defense Ministry. However, the spokesperson for Ukraine's Joint Forces grouping, Viktor Tryabov, said there were no changes to report in that region. Russian claims of battlefield progress have shown discrepancies. The Moscow-appointed head of Luhansk announced its full capture last June. Bangladesh. Food aid slashed at refugee camp. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya refugees struggling to survive in Bangladesh's overcrowded camps will see their food assistance cut starting on Wednesday, raising alarm throughout the increasingly desperate community. The 1.2 million Rohingya trapped in the squalid camps receive $12 a month per person, an amount the persecuted minority from Myanmar has long warned is barely sustainable. Most of the Rohingya in the camps fled brutal attacks by Myanmar's military in 2017, and they are legally barred from working in Bangladesh. Under the United Nations World Food Programme's new tiered system, The amount each person receives will vary based on the severity of their family's needs. And that was from the Associated Press. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, bomb Iran but blow up NATO? It would be the height of folly and help Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing. Could the Iran war do what even Vladimir Putin couldn't and blow up the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance? That's no longer an idle question, as most of Europe refuses to help the U.S., and President Trump responds by threatening to leave NATO. This would be the dumbest alliance breakup in modern history. The immediate fault here lies with Europe. Spain and Italy are blocking U.S. military flights for Iran from their bases. And Mr. Trump says the Macron government has blocked flights over France. Add its reluctance to help clear the Strait of Hormuz, and Europe is playing into every mega stereotype about a one-sided Western alliance. Europe's frustration with Mr. Trump is understandable, given his failure to consult about the war in advance and his taunts about occupying Greenland. Mr. Trump's refusal to do more to help Ukraine resist Russia is another legitimate gripe. Yet, as we warned, when the war started, Europe might come to regret not helping in the Persian Gulf when Mr. Trump asked. The U.S. president wouldn't ask if he didn't need the help, and this was a chance to show the alliance is a two-way street. Europe's economy is vulnerable to Iran's ability to hold oil flows hostage as prices spike and shortages loom. The continent should want to reopen the Gulf quickly and avoid another surge of refugees. Europe's capitals are in range of Iran's ballistic missiles, and decades of underinvestment also means Europe can't defend itself without U.S. help. London struggled to deploy a naval destroyer to the Mediterranean to defend a British base on Cyprus is a national embarrassment and an apt symbol of Europe's choice to favor social welfare over self-defense. Wellington, Nelson, and Churchill are weeping. A U.S. withdrawal from NATO would nonetheless serve only Russia, Iran, and China. Blowing up NATO has been the main goal of Russian strategy since the alliance formed in 1949. Mr. Putin would be emboldened, and at the very time Ukraine is showing new strength in resisting Russia's invasion forces. The larger reality is that Russia and Iran are working together as an axis against the West. The two share weapons, especially drones and missiles, and Russia is providing intelligence to Iran about American targets. Mr. Trump is especially obtuse on this point, refusing even to acknowledge this Russian harm to U.S. troops, much less condemn it. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ducks the question whenever he's asked about it. This axis of adversaries that includes China wants to weaken the Western alliance and the free world. It wants the U.S. and Israel to fail to defeat Iran and Russia to defeat Ukraine militarily and become the dominant power in Europe. If the Western allies let this happen, it will be the height of folly and an historic tragedy. From the opinion pages, a Mid-East moment of hope. The commentariat's bleak verdict depends on lazy readings of recent history. By Barton Swaim. If all you knew about the war in Iran is what you read in the American and European press, you might conclude that the U.S. has never prosecuted a war so ineptly as it has this one. In fact, nearly the opposite is true. Iran's rulers have been on the job for a month. Their predecessors have died on February 28th. The U.S. has destroyed most of Iran's navy and neutered what remains of it. Its air defenses no longer exist. Some large part of its ballistic missiles have been used, destroyed, or damaged. Its capacity to build more is nearly at an end. Iran's nuclear program, central to the regime's identity, lies under rubble. Israeli strikes have inflicted havoc on the Islamic Republic's internal repression apparatus. The regime's terrorist proxies appear quiet or on the run, suggesting a shortage of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders telling them what to do. Most of America's and Europe's news media, meanwhile, sift through the details to find evidence of U.S. incompetence. The administration didn't plan for missile and drone strikes on its bases. The war benefits Russia. It benefits China. War planners didn't count on Iran's closing the Strait of Hormuz. On and on. These claims deserve attention, though dispositive they are not. The war obliged the U.S. to ease sanctions on Russian oil, but the destruction of Russia's chief client in the Middle East creates problems for Moscow that far outweigh any short-term boost in oil revenue. The complaint that a war in Iran distracts the U.S. from Chinese aggression rests on the truism that a nation's attention is finite. All wars distract. As for the strait, its remaining open would have been the real surprise. You have to assume some of this relentless pessimism stems from the belief, familiar after a decade, that whatever Donald Trump does must lead to disaster. That's a sorry way to get at the truth. But the smallness and lockstep defeatism of so much commentary on the war also stems from the normal human tendency to interpret today's big thing as another version of yesterday's. A lazy, cyclical view of events sets in. The Iran War is like the Iraq War, which was a version of the Vietnam War. All sooner or later end in chaos and failure. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, as the maxim has it. But it rhymes infrequently. Linear thinking can enlighten where cyclical doesn't. The overthrow of Saddam Hussein and attempt to replace his regime with a democratic government failed to remake the Middle East in the way its planners hoped. But the removal of Iraq as a global mischief maker set in motion a longer and wider remaking in which the Arab Gulf states moved closer to the U.S. and Israel to thwart the remaining menace, Iran. Since then, for a host of complicated and mostly unforeseeable reasons, disparate circumstances across the region incline slowly in a promising direction. Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has undertaken the risky work of westernizing the kingdom and abandoning the cynical policy of funding radical madrasas abroad to buy off the Islamist. The regime of another implacable enemy of the West, that of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, unexpectedly collapsed in 2024, an event made possible by Israel's degradation of its guarantor, Iran. No one knows which course Syria under Ahmed al-Shara will choose, but for the first time in half a century, its government appears to want amicable relations with the U.S. and Israel. Lebanon, also for the first time in decades, makes progress in ridding itself of Hezbollah, weakened as that jihadist terror group is by the travails of its backers in Tehran. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun, breaking a taboo against so much as acknowledging Israel's legitimacy, gestures toward a settlement with the Jewish state for the purpose of disarming Hezbollah. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain grow daily more committed to the work of defanging or toppling Iran, beginning with the forcible opening of the Strait of Hormuz. In the background lie the Abraham Accords and the recognition by the Gulf Arab states that their survival depends as much on commerce with the West, including Israel, as it does on oil. Bahrain and the UAE are signatories. Saudi Arabia hints that joining isn't unthinkable. It's notable that the foreign policy mandarins in the U.S. and Europe either opposed or scorned each of the big events that made possible this moment of hope: the Iraq War, the Abraham Accords, and the kinetic strikes on Iran, first by Israel and then by the U.S. The mandarins preferred Barack Obama's nuclear deal, which failed to pacify Iran and explicitly did nothing to curtail its exportation of terror. A stabler and more commerce-driven Middle East has an immeasurably greater chance of emerging after the Islamic Republic falls, or anyway falls to its knees. Everything depends on what a fractured and abused Iranian populace can do when the bombs stop dropping. No one knows, although one may reasonably surmise, based on Israeli competence so far, that the regime's opponents will have access to weapons and intelligence. Another reasonable inference: Iran's rulers, whoever they are at this point, would rather die than relinquish their ambitions at the hands of the great Satan. They may get their druthers in the end. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Why the International Criminal Court isn't taking on Iran. The ICC's silence reveals its politicization and the urgent need for tougher American sanctions. By Eugene Kantorovich. Iran has achieved a singular statistic in its current front against Israel. After firing more than 400 missiles over nearly a month, Tehran apparently hasn't hit a single Israeli military target. That leaves the Islamic Republic with a 100% civilian casualty ratio, a benchmark of the number of civilian casualties relative to combatant ones. Not long ago, civilian casualty ratios were at the heart of discussions of the Israel-Gaza war, with Israel's critics claiming that disproportional levels of civilian casualties were evidence of war crimes. In reality, Israel's infliction of 30% to 40% military casualties on an adversary hiding behind civilians was impressive by the standards of urban warfare. Now that Iran is batting a consistent .000, commentators seem less focused on casualty ratios. The International Criminal Court has been conspicuously quiet on the Iran conflict. While Israel fought Hamas after its October 7, 2023 massacre, ICC officials repeatedly criticized Israel's conduct of the war and eventually issued arrest warrants for top Israeli officials. Hamas's current leadership hasn't been charged, and as Iran lashes out in all directions, The Hague is silent. Some say the ICC isn't involved because Iran, like its Arab neighbors, hasn't joined the organization. The ICC is supposed to have jurisdiction only over member states. But Israel doesn't belong to the court either. The ICC invented a state of Palestine in 2015 and allowed it to join the court, a legal fiction used to justify investigations of the Jewish state. Last month, an Iranian missile killed 4 Palestinian women at a bridal salon near Hebron. According to the ICC's principles, this attack in Palestine gives the court jurisdiction over the responsible Iranian officials as well. The court can investigate this and other missile strikes in what it regards as Palestinian territory. It can also look into Iran's continuing attacks on civilian ships, many of which are flagged in ICC member states. In recent weeks, several civilian sailors have been killed in attacks by Iran on Marshall Islands, flagged vessels in the Persian Gulf. Strikes on disparate vessels may seem a thin reed for an ICC investigation, but the court has been moved to act by less. When Israel boarded a flotilla of vessels seeking to break its blockade of Gaza in 2010, they faced resistance from the crew, resulting in the deaths of 9 people on board, in addition to 10 wounded soldiers. The ICC used the fact that one of the boats had been deflagged to Comoros, an archipelago off Africa and ICC member, to open a case against Israel that lasted for 7 years. The ICC appears to be sitting this one out, not because it lacks jurisdiction, because it lacks political will or perhaps interest. Iran has a track record of trying to assassinate its critics abroad and sponsoring bombings of buildings abroad. Would a country enforce an ICC warrant against Iranian leaders, fearing it would lead to terror attacks? The Hague's jurist may recall the 2015 murder of Alberto Nisman, the Argentinian prosecutor investigating Iran's 1994 bombing of a Jewish center in Buenos Aires. An ICC investigation wouldn't necessarily change Iran's conduct. After massacring thousands of their own people in response to this year's protest, Tehran's leaders will do whatever they can to survive. But the court's irrelevance here also demonstrates its structural flaws. It can, at most, deter liberal democracies, thus tilting the playing field against such states when they confront despotic regimes. The ICC's prosecutors and judges take their cues from the international legal profession from which they are recruited. Prominent international law publications have published theories about how the court might exercise jurisdiction over Trump administration officials, including based on attacks against drug boats from member states. The ICC's current silence underscores its politicization and the danger it presents to America and its allies, especially to members of the Trump administration after the president's term ends. Last month, a panel of outside judges demurred on taking employment action against the ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan. Mr. Khan has been on leave since May following sexual assault allegations by a subordinate. Mr. Khan has denied any sexual misconduct. In an email to staff, he wrote that he would go on leave until the completion of the investigation. An investigation by a team from the United Nations found evidence of non-consensual sexual contact, but the judges determined that it failed to meet a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, though this wasn't a criminal proceeding. The ICC uses a lower legal threshold for bringing an arrest warrant against a democratically elected leader of a non-member state than it does for firing an employee. Mr. Trump has imposed sanctions on certain ICC officials, but refrained from targeting the court itself. Now it seems Mr. Khan will return to his post. He has threatened to prosecute American politicians who impose sanctions on the court. If the administration doesn't take broader and stronger action soon, Mr. Trump has a higher likelihood of becoming an ICC defendant than the massacring mullahs he is fighting. Hormuz Shmormuz. The U.S. needs to define its goals and let other problems take care of themselves. By Holman W. Jenkins, Jr. News reports from the indirect negotiations mediated by the Pakistanis say the Iranian regime thinks it's winning thanks to its threats to Persian Gulf shipping. The estimable Fred Kagan of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute says the optimal endgame for the U.S. now is to prove it can reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Can we do that? I don't know, he told the Call Me Back podcast. Yikes. If the primary U.S. war aim now is fixing a problem the war caused, this won't strike many as brilliant war management. The Trump administration obviously understood the Strait of Hormuz was at risk in any joust with Iran. The problem is the administration's half-in, half-out messaging. If the U.S. goal was simply to dismantle certain regime capabilities, and this was properly signaled, the strait likely wouldn't be threatened. This has been the lesson of the past 10 years. The Iranian regime has repeatedly demonstrated an unwillingness to escalate. Remember its carefully telegraphed missile strikes after previous scuffles, easily shot down by the U.S. and its allies. The Trump administration therefore had a pretty good idea of how to play it if the idea was to bomb things in Iran with relative impunity by advertising that its aims were limited. On the other hand, if the goal was regime change, a Hormuz counterattack would certainly have been anticipated. And whatever the U.S. says now, U.S.-Israeli action said regime change, assassinations of 250 officials, attacks on the regime's political police, threats to its oil revenues, calls for public uprisings. The moment that gave me pause was when the administration backed away from unleashing Iran's Kurdish rebels. Yes, if the U.S. goals were limited, a certain delicacy here was appropriate. But if the U.S. means to impose maximal stress on Iran's ruling group, if the goal is to push the regime to the wall, then throw everything at it, including the Kurds, at least everything short of a presumably unacceptable U.S. ground invasion. Which brings us to Donald Trump. Everyone, including the Israelis, understands whatever happens next will be entirely the decision of the U.S. president. Recall from its first days the war's revolution in regime targeting, which set in progress an implicit negotiation. Iran's leaders want their lives and personal security back. They want to engage in electronic communications again. They want to stop hiding from their own people and Israeli bombs, pretty much the same thing given how many Iranians are helping the Israelis with their targeting. In Mr. Trump's strategic noggin, this is the game. Judging from statements going back to the June 2025 attacks, when he specifically referenced having Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in his sights, at any moment might pop out an implicit Trump deal that kicks the can on Iran's fissionable material and ballistic missiles in return for regime survivors relaxing their grip on the strait. Would this be an ignominious outcome? Maybe, but the verdict could also look a lot different in a year or two if the regime has shuffled off the stage from the combined effect of U.S.-Israeli pressure, its own failures, and the revulsion of its people. A problem of our age is the strategic non sequiturs that leaders turn into tests of their prestige and manhood. Most important, and the likeliest way for the U.S. to go off the rails, is whether the U.S. should incur large costs and risks to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. My answer is no. Those small investments in that direction are fine. Are such distinctions too complicated for readers, needing to be buoyed by rah-rah of one kind or another? Happily, our species has evolved to carry around large brains for a reason. Which brings me to my optimistic long-term prediction. The world will become a safer place once leaders, as a matter of course, feed their strategic ambitions and calculations through an LLM before acting on them. LLM is a metaphor for exposing yourself to new knowledge so your mind can absorb and connect ideas. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 2nd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal, which we read every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and have a happy Easter, a blessed Passover, and whatever religious holiday you celebrate.